end of a great run with, well, really, if you look at it, with
both the men's and the women's
both
teams.
men's and the women's teams. And then if you throw in, obviously with Omaha, they had a somewhat older roster, and Alexis Markowski, her final game with Nebraska's women's basketball team.
Yep.
Certainly going to be a changing of the guard. And it's always interesting when you get to this point, and I guess I'm really referring more to the men's side now. Anytime you reach this moment, and Creighton's kind of been through this moment on a few different occasions. Obviously, you go back to the Doug Jahens, Grant, Ethan senior class.
Yes.
And the end of that era.
Yep.
And then you fast forward a little bit later, and you've got, the era with.
Yeah, what would you say was the next one?
Justin Patton, Marcus Foster,
Watson.
Maurice Watson, thank you.
Yeah.
I kept thinking of his somewhat problematic nickname.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that.
So that was another generation. Then you fast forward, the team that won the Big East championship.
The COVID year.
With Zagorowski and Tyshawn Alexander, so that group. And now it's really this one.
Yeah.
Or I guess it's not even so much this one, it's one guy.
Correct, because that's a funny thing.
Steven was here for 2 years.
Yeah.
But this was
about
the Ryan Kalkbrenner era.
And that's the thing, is his era has like all these other ends of like, well, now these guys are gone, and now these guys are gone. And like he was the constant, because of the COVID eligibility, because of having the 5 years, and because, he was always there. And he got better every single season.
He did.
You go look back at game 1 versus game whatever, I don't think anybody saw this type of development happening over the course of his career.
Yeah. And, it comes to an end. And so the questions are always, will it ever get better than this? Will it ever get better than this? Will they be able to rebuild? Is this, because the criticism or the critique back, when Doug left was, well, now what's Matt going to do without his kid?
Yep.
And they proved, after a couple of years, they're going to be just fine. And then, the same thing happened,
after that 2016-17 season.
Correct.
How are they going to do this?
And, the Jays will certainly be very active in the transfer portal. And I think, I think in the era of the portal, it's all going to be about what you put into it. If you have the resources behind it, as long as you have competent people, because it's still about finding the right mix. It's still finding about the people that fit your system in terms of a style of play, but also fit your locker room. The transfer portal has not changed the dynamic of the locker room.
NIL has changed.
In that, you still need to find people that fit what you're doing, or things could run off course.
Sure.
That's no different than when you go out and recruit a class.
Yeah.
The difference is with the transfer portal, you're getting more seasoned people who have been in more locker rooms. And so it's kind of fascinating to see if it's easier or harder to have, a bunch of transfer portals come in versus a bunch of recruits come in. Because obviously with 4-year recruits, high school recruits, you have folks who are just beginning their college education. So it's a whole new experience. But you bring in someone from the transfer portal, especially someone who's been to maybe 2 different programs or 3 different programs. They've been through a whole bunch of changes, and they're kind of calloused to it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they're used to it.
Think about a guy like Jemiah Neal and, what they expected or hoped for from him.
Right.
And what he was able to bring them, given all the seasoning that he had in the college game.
Well, I think of a guy like Janai Broom from Auburn. He started, I think it was at Washington State for a year, and then went down to Kennesaw, and then to Auburn. So he'd been to 3 different schools, but you kind of
at various levels.
And so, you're always going to need that dynamic. You're still going to need to bring people to fit, but the ability to now go out and, unlike when Mac had to replace the Tyshawn Alexanders and the Marcus Zagorowskis of the world, as he did that year, it was mainly that was the baby Blue Jays, the baby Jays, the Kalumas, Trey Alexander, that group. With this, you can just go out and try, at least in some degree, to plug and play. Say, okay, well, this is what we lost. This is what we need to go out and get a seasoned person who has done it.
And you hit on something too, what you lost. As of today, you don't really know. You can say like, oh man, this guy could come back and this guy could come back and this guy could come back. But any of those players could also decide to move on from the program and go somewhere else. Yeah. And that's the rub of college sports, not college basketball, but college sports at this moment in time.
And so I guess, at the end of the day, my philosophy on this is Greg McDermott now has shown it through different eras of roster building and now different eras of, player development that they've been very adaptable. It will look very different next year. But if there's a guy who's kind of earned the benefit of the doubt of knowing what he needs, going out and getting it, and then making the necessary adaptations to the style to make it work, Mac has been that one.
Yeah.
But I understand where their uneasiness would be some uneasiness.
Is this in response to the Chattel column or just the discussion in general?
Well, I think it's a discussion in general. Obviously, Chattel wrote about it, and it's not a bad premise because we do it all the time. I mean, we did it with Nebraska football.
How are they going to replace this guy? How are they going to replace this
when
guy?
They had to replace Rozier and Gill and Fryer? How are they going to do this?
Because you think it's never going to get better than this.
Right.
It's never. And the interesting thing about the Tom Chattel column, and for those who haven't read it, I know it kind of made some waves this weekend amongst Creighton fans in particular. It said Creighton's golden era might be done. Can the Jays ever acquire this much talent again? It's like headline alone leads you to believe, okay, this is going to be, can they replace these guys? I read it a little bit more, and I'll say this. I think Tom is very plugged in with Greg McDermott and the Creighton apparatus, if you will, right? And so I read it, and maybe I was trying to read between the lines, but I read it almost as will he want to be a part of this era of college basketball as it continues to move forward? I couldn't help but think about Jay Wright when I was reading it, given that he was all over my television this weekend talking about a variety of games, and a few years ago, I'm guessing that there were similar columns about them. Can they do this again? Can they do this again? And the answer was no, but not for the reason of just acquiring talent. It's because he didn't want to be a part of the college sports system anymore, at least in the old way that he was. And this is, I'm certainly not saying Greg McDermott is going to retire tomorrow, but I do wonder, just given all the conversations we've had over the last few years about the variety of jobs that have opened up and how it's, turned into a bigger payday for McDermott and he stayed along with Creighton. When you lose a player like a Kalkbrenner or an era like this comes to an end, the next step now is going to be hard just because you're going to have to not completely restart because there will be players. I think we agree there will be players that were on this roster that will be on next year's roster. But you're closer to starting from scratch than you are just kind of plugging and playing, at least in my opinion.
I would argue that Mac has already been pretty adaptive to transfers.
Definitely.
I mean, some of the guys that I mentioned, Watson and Marcus Foster in particular, they were transferred.
That kind of kicked off that new wave.
It did. It kicked off that new era. So I think in terms of a transfer product, Greg McDermott is very comfortable with that. And so from that standpoint, I don't think that is a deterrent. Now, is the dealing with basically your whole rosters being a free agent?
Yes. That's what's different about today versus
yeah. Certainly I can't imagine he, like a lot of other people, probably would rather have it a different way. They would rather not have to go back and re-recruit the players that are already on their team. But I have never sensed from Mac a reticence of not wanting to play in this market. And the only reason I say that is he has been very active in helping promote the Bird Club, which is what makes all of this possible in the first place. That's Creighton's collective. And I know there's a part of him that would rather not have to do as much of that and just get back to the coaching side of it.
Because when he got into the business, it was the other side of it.
But he hasn't been hesitant to endorse it and, help feed it and work with it. So I guess in a long way, what I'm saying is I don't see him being like Jay Wright and just saying, you know what, I've kind of been there, done that. Now, Jay Wright was also in a pretty comfortable location where he had won at the highest level.
He'd won 2 national championships.
In a similar way to Tom Osborne, he went out on top.
Yeah.
And while this is the greatest run ever in Creighton basketball history,
there are still some things to do.
There are rungs on that ladder.
Hasn't won the conference tournament. Obviously, we've talked about that. And while he hasn't won a natty, I mean, the next step in the tournament would be the Final Four.
Sure.
He has not been able to do that. Alan asks, what's the peak era of the Coach Mack era at Creighton? I mean, I would certainly think it is I think you could start with like the COVID year, like the year that led into COVID, because they win the regular season. And then the next year they finally break through and they make the Sweet 16. And then the next year they go 1-1, but they lose a real good game to Kansas, and then they go to the Elite Eight.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess if you want to add on the next 2 years too, you can. But I would say that was the stretch where you break through in the regular season in the conference, and you just know at that point it's a matter of time, and you feel like you get something taken away from you because of the cancellation. And then the next year you go to the Sweet 16. Finally, you run into Gonzaga, you run into the national champ the next year in Kansas, and then you go to the Elite Eight, and you're this close to the Final Four.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say that that's the stretch. And that's why whenever, I think about, can they ever match this or whatever? It's like, I know how I felt at the end of the 2014 season. And I remember thinking, like, I just don't know how they're going to do this, because I thought, look, they're never going to get the player of the year again in the whole sport. And that's not the best Creighton team we've seen, in the last decade, let alone in our lifetime. So I think that's one of the things that, he can definitely lean back on. It's going to be pretty interesting to see the roster that they put together, and maybe who today do you view one way that in a few years you're viewing in a much different way? Because I think a Kalkbrenner 4 years ago, I never would have expected this. Because Happer said something on his show today, like maybe building around Jackson McAndrew. He's like, can they build a roster around him? And I remember thinking, like, come on, no way. But I would have said the same thing about Kalkbrenner a few years ago, and they built the roster around him. So maybe they can.
They have shown the ability to develop players.
Oh, yeah.
They have shown that ability. And Jackson McAndrew, had 2 really nice games in the NCAA tournament against power competition and against some high-level basketball players. So, yeah, can you build around that? Sure. You certainly can. And it'll be really interesting to watch, because this will be, not that they haven't been active in the portal, but just because of the sheer losses. I mean, at least 3 major losses.
Mm-hmm.
That they're going to be really active in the portal, and to see how it navigates, and to see what gaps are filled, and where they hit home runs and where maybe they don't get home runs, will be really fascinating to watch. So for the first time in the what we would call the portal era, the Jays are very active players.
Definitely.
It's not just going out and having to replace Ryan Nembhard.
Yes.
Which they did with Stephen Ashworth. You got to replace Ashworth. You got to replace Kalkbrenner. You got to replace Jemiah Neal. And we don't know what the rest of the roster is going to be like. Haven't seen anything yet in the transfer portal today, but
Correct.
there's plenty of time for all of that.
Oh, yeah.